want to say hello and welcome everyone to a virtual panel on ChatGPT and Education. My name is Brendan. I'm faculty here at UMass Computer Science, and I'm one of the associate directors of the Computational Social Science Institute. Here at CSSI, we're focused on building multidisciplinary bridges across campus between different departments and colleges, looking especially ways that computation can help us understand society, interactions between computation and the social sciences. And there's a big topic that's been in the news a lot recently involving ChatGPT, generative language models, and in particular their impact on education. This is a topic that we think would be great to bring together a panel of folks with interdisciplinary expertise across multiple areas here where we actually have real expertise here on campus. And so in today's virtual panel discussion, it's going to go until 1 o'clock. We are recording the event. It's going to be posted online. And this event's co-sponsored by the Computational Social Science Institute, the Institute for Social Science Research, and the Public Interest Technology Initiative, all here at UMass. And so to get started, many of us at least have seen a lot of hype around language generation models. In particular, ChatGPT came out just a few months ago, seems to have been shown around a lot. We have all sorts of takes and opinions posted by, I don't know, everyone has different opinions about different famous people, all sorts of ideas going around. And in particular, in very specific topics, such as education, which is an obvious one that affects many of us, we've just seen, here's just a few news headlines from, I think, literally yesterday I took these. Lots of questions and worry, lots of experiences with this, lots of experiences with, I don't know, parents, particular places in the world, why not, right? All these things are going on. And just one question I think some of us have is, what is the hype about this versus what is the reality? And so one way to approach this is to ask some of our colleagues who really are research experts in the areas of computation and education, who we're going to talk to today. So today we have 3 panelists I'm super excited to introduce. First, we'll hear from Mohit Iyer. Professor Iyer is faculty in computer science here at UMass. He researches natural language processing in order to develop methods better model and evaluate language generation. In particular, he's worked with this class of language models that we'll be talking about today, ChatGPT and related. He's worked in particular areas where systems that can help humans compose text, such as in creative or fictional domains. Next, we'll hear from Professor Tori Trust. Tori is a professor in the College of Education at UMass Amherst, and is an expert in the intersection of technology and learning. And she's already written a bit about ChatGPT and education. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Sulin Blodgett. Sulin is a senior researcher at Microsoft Research, the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics in AI group, the FATE group, which is an excellent research in the areas of technology and interactions with society. Dr. Blodgett studies ethical and social implications of language technologies, and looks to find ways to better support or improve the social context and how language technologies are used. And so the format will be, we'll have about 10 minutes presentations from each panelist in turn, and then we'll open up for questions. For questions, we ask that you post your question or maybe the topic for your question in the chat, and then we'll call on people in approximate order to just ask your question out loud if that's what you want. Sound okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started with Mohit. Hello.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Is this visible? Okay, yeah, so my role here in this 10-minute presentation is just to explain what ChatGPT is and how it works. And so I'm going to try and do this with minimal technical jargon, but there will be some, just because you might hear these terms over and over in media articles or papers or blog posts from these companies. So it's important to understand what they're referring to. So at its core, ChatGPT is an instance of a type of AI model called a language model. And language models are simply computer programs that predict the word that follows some given input text. And we call this input text a prefix. So for example, I might have a prefix like students opened there. And the language model would be asked to predict what word comes next. So this could be, like books or laptops or backpacks or something like that. So you pass this prefix into a language model, and what it actually does is it produces a probability distribution over all of the possible words that exist in the English language. And you might observe that the probability of books is very high given this prefix, and the probability of something like zoo is very low. So these are probabilistic models. Okay, so let's just take a look at how you might create a language model, because this is also important in understanding, their capabilities thus far and and their limitations. So initially, a language model starts off by making totally random predictions about what the next word is. So here, given students open there, if you take an untrained language model, it might predict, for example, that the word sofa has an 87% probability of being the next word. Obviously, this doesn't make sense, but the language model has not seen any human written data in order to know that this is unacceptable. So what we do is we train this language model. You've probably seen this word train before in reference to, making these models better and more powerful. Basically, what we do is we take a human written continuation of this prefix. So maybe I observe students opened their books somewhere in a book or on the internet. So we take the ground truth human written next word books, and we kind of update our language model so that next time we see this prefix students open there, the probability of sofa goes way down and the probability of the correct word books goes up. And so you can imagine repeating this process for billions and billions of words. The language model is like iteratively learning to predict what humans write as the next word. And in this process, it picks up a lot of important linguistic information, right? It needs to know that, okay, it's likely that there's a noun following this prefix, and maybe it's a plural noun. Maybe it's something related to the content of education or classrooms or something like that. So this simple task of predicting the next word actually has it can imbue this language model with a lot of world knowledge and common sense reasoning abilities. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail. There won't be any equations or anything, so don't worry about that. But it is also important to know, how these models are representing and manipulating the text that you give it. So as most of you probably know, like in order for computers to interact with input that you give it, they need to convert whatever the input is into numbers, right? Computers work on top of numbers, not on top of words. So the first step is to convert this prefix into a sequence of numbers. And of course, we as humans can't really interpret this sequence of numbers, like it means nothing to us, but to a computer, it's actually very meaningful. And then the whole operation behind a language model like ChatGPT is just to perform a huge amount of mathematical operations on top of these numbers. And so these operations are implemented via what are known as neural network layers. You might see that in explanations or blogs about these kinds of models. Essentially, they're just doing a lot of math on top of these numbers in order to finally predict the probability of the next word to be as reasonable as possible compared to the human text. So you might hear people saying, like these models are really, really large, and that's why they're able to, generate high quality text and so on. So what they mean when they say the model is large is that they have a large number of parameters. So parameters are just how these mathematical operations that the language model is computing are implemented. And so these parameters, when we talk about training, these are numbers that are being updated in order to make the probability of the ground truth word books higher. So that's a very high level summary of what is going on here. And so a language model like ChatGPT has a huge number of parameters, meaning it's applying, a huge number of operations over the input students open there. And we actually gain a lot of capabilities with these language models when we scale up the amount, the number of parameters and the amount of training data that they've seen. So how many times we are actually adjusting these parameters to make better predictions of the next word. So this is an example from Google's PaLM paper, where they state that as you increase the number of parameters in a language model, you start to observe these emergent abilities. So abilities that are present in large language models, but not in smaller ones. And these emergent abilities are what has kind of captured the public's mind and users of ChatGPT. So for example, if you look on the right here, we see an example of logical inference. So Shelley is from Virginia, but she's visiting a city with a famous market where they throw the fish. And the question is it likely that Shelley will be near the Pacific Ocean? And if you read this model output, you can see that it goes through a couple chains of reasoning where it figures out that, you know, Seattle is where that famous market is, and Seattle is near the Pacific Ocean. She's visiting Seattle, so therefore the answer is yes. And this kind of ability has been scaled now to with like GPT-4 solving very complicated exam questions and things like that. But the core model is still just predicting the next word. So one other important thing to note is that these language models are continuously improving from your feedback. So these are a couple screenshots from ChatGPT where you see over here, there's a thumbs up and thumbs down. So if you thumbs down a response that's generated by ChatGPT, they will periodically update their model such that the model will not produce those responses that are thumbs down anymore, and they might prefer responses that are thumbs up. Similarly, on the bottom, we see a screenshot of Google's Bard interface, which was released this week, and you see there's a similar thumbs up and thumbs down. So we have this interesting situation now where all of these huge companies, they need human feedback in order to improve their models. So they have to allow humans to interact with their models. That said, they don't want other companies to steal their model and make a better one. So there's, you know, a very, we'll see what happens, but already we see, for example, researchers from Stanford managed to extract one of OpenAI's models into a much smaller model that had similar capabilities. So perhaps things won't remain in the power of a couple companies, you know, in the coming 1 or 2 years. So I just wanted to conclude with a, you know, an example that might be of interest to this audience from the GPT-4 model that was released a couple days ago. And there was this big paper released by Microsoft yesterday that showed all the interesting capabilities that this new model has. And particularly, there's a section on the theory of mind capabilities. So I'm not going to give my opinion about this one way or another, but I thought it would be interesting to share. I'll briefly just summarize what's happening. This is the input to the language model. You will read about a scenario and then you'll answer some questions about it. The scenario is quite interesting. Mark has a Thanksgiving meal coming up. He has a Republican uncle, a Democrat mom. They always fight about politics. Neither of them were vaccinated for COVID because the uncle decided COVID isn't that serious. And the mom believes that COVID is dangerous, but she's careful about putting non-natural products into her body. So the situation here is that Mark wants to convince both of them to get the vaccine, but also avoid some sort of, you know, terrible argument starting up. So his current plan is to steer clear of any politics and just present statistics on the safety of the vaccine in the hopes that it convinces his uncle and his mom. And the question that the researchers asked to GPT-4 is there an argument that might convince both mom and uncle without causing a fight? Please explain why. So the model generates the following, which I will just summarize. First, it says, you know, it's you can't have a definitive answer to this question, but its possible answer is that the best argument to convince both the mom and uncle without causing a fight is to appeal to their shared love and concern for their family. And it even gives a quotation of what you might say to the uncle and mom, which to summarize is basically like, I love you both very much. I worry about your health and safety. It's not about politics or freedom. It's about protecting yourself. I'm not trying to pressure you or judge you. I'm just trying to show you that I care. And it also says this argument might work better than Mark's plan because of all of these reasons, which are, quite plausible. It acknowledges both of their feelings without challenging or dismissing them. It shifts focus from facts to emotions, which are more likely to influence their behavior change, and so on. So I think last year we would never have expected a model to be able to, generate things that are this plausible. And you see similar quality outputs with many other tasks like code generation, or even now in the image to text space. So yeah, I would continue to expect the capabilities of these models to improve over the next few years. And of course, this means for teachers and students, there's probably going to be a big paradigm shift in how we make assignments and how we evaluate our students. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mohit. That was really helpful in understanding ChatGPT, something as someone in the College of Education, I'm continue to try to wrap my head around. So I will get into the educational implications. Again, my name is Tori Trust. I'm Associate Professor of Learning Technology in the College of Education. I'm going to highlight 4 things to know. I'm not going to go deep into all of the things regarding like plagiarism and redesigning teaching and learning, just kind of what you need to know about how ChatGPT is and can be used in education. So starting with, it can be a helpful tool. Basically, ChatGPT can write anything you might write. It is an AI writing tool. So it could help write course syllabi and course syllabi policies, learning objectives, emails to students, scripts for your mini lectures or presentations, feedback that you give to students, letters of recommendation. I can't tell you how many professors I've seen on social media who are so excited to use ChatGPT to reduce the time they spend writing letters. Not that I recommend fully taking a letter from ChatGPT and using it for a student letter of recommendation, but there is excitement around that. It can help write test quiz questions, study guides, discussion prompts, rubrics, directions for learning activities. So you could say, help students have to design an infographic, give 7 directions for doing so, and it will provide that writing that you could give to students to help them complete an activity. Stories can give model text for students to annotate and review, like high and low quality essays that students could examine, suggestions for differentiating learning, and more. And as you see on the GIF on the right over here, I asked ChatGPT what it can write to help higher ed faculty and staff. It can provide teaching tips like strategies for inclusive classroom environments, best practices for engaging students in online learning. It can connect you to research, effective methods for assessing student learning outcomes, ways to promote innovation in higher education, best practices for experiential learning. So it can write kind of anything you ask it to write and anything you might write. When asked on social media, several educators replied how they're already using ChatGPT in their teaching. They're using it for discussion points, questions, topics, identifying misconceptions. This group talked about how ChatGPT can help students with all 7 stages of the writing process, everything from choosing a topic to outlining, drafting, and revising and proofreading. This educator talked about having ChatGPT write a rap about similes and metaphors, and then her students revised and created their own music with that. Can help with project rubrics, sample survey questions, research questions, and it can even help students evaluate their own work. Like in this example, a student loaded a social entrepreneurship project into ChatGPT and asked it for it to find everything wrong with the solution, and it did. And then he revised it and built a new prototype. I've seen educators who have used it to write conference proposals. In this case, Dr. Ian O'Byrne had ChatGPT write the entire proposal that he submitted. Of course, he let the conference organizers know, and his presentation was about ChatGPT, so they found it fitting. I don't recommend handing it completely off as your own. And I love this example of, there's a great group on Facebook higher ed discussions of AI writing with educators constantly grappling with ChatGPT and AI writing tools in education. This individual talked about improving the diversity of scientists in her syllabus, an environmental science course, learning about BIPOC and LGBTQ scientists. So it saved her time from doing the research to go out and find it. And then once she had her list, then she went and researched and figured out how to improve her own syllabus. It can be used for coming up with examples. This is a great article here. And again, these slides, I'll put this in the chat box, and everything, all the images are linked to articles. This talks about how ChatGPT can be an example machine. You know, we're coming up with examples all the time as educators to make teaching and learning more concrete and understandable for students. And sometimes that takes quite a bit of time, and ChatGPT can help with that. It can even help with simulations like this educator. This is another great blog post by Dr. Brian Alexander, walking through designing simulations that would help students think about critical aspects of history. But it's not just something that you might turn to do all your work for you. Not yet, maybe way down the road, but you know, teaching is complex and challenging, and educators who have critically analyzed the output ChatGPT creates for educational materials, like coming up with a list of multiple choice questions for a certain topic, have found that, you know, they often spend more time revising what ChatGPT produces than just coming up with the questions themselves. Or in this case, a high school teacher had ChatGPT write a lesson plan and design learning materials for them, and then taught it as is, and asked students what they thought about it. And they said, meh, it was bland. Teachers shouldn't use this for designing their lesson plans. So it's more of something that's helpful for creative thinking, or you might ask it to come up with a presentation script, but revise and remix it, or design a series of learning objectives, but really go in and make sure they fit with your class and your needs. ChatGPT can also be helpful for student learning. So it can help with students with personalized tutoring in any subject. As I mentioned before, 7 steps of the writing process support. It can translate text into many different languages, provide test and quiz practice questions. If students have a, you know, assessment or midterm coming up, they could ask it to produce practice questions for them to improve their thinking, or even provide them with a rubric to evaluate their own work or projects for classes. Podcasts, video scripts. So again, it can't produce the podcast or video, although there's other AI tools out there that are multimodal. And I think GPT-4 will have a multimodal aspect, but it can help students with the writing part of multimedia projects. Directions to complete activities, summaries of text, complex topics. This is one of the most common uses I've seen from students, is that when they come across something that's really hard for them to understand, so they'll turn to ChatGPT to help summarize it or make it easier to understand. And you can even ask ChatGPT something like, explain string theory, but to a 5-year-old, or to a high school student, or to an expert in the field, and it will provide different explanations based on the developmental age. And that can help students, you know, with clarifying their thinking and understanding of a topic. It can provide notes for inputted text. So I took a TED Talk and the transcript from a TED Talk, and I inputted it into ChatGPT and said, give me notes on this, and it did that. Tips and ideas for creative thinking, cover letters, resumes, and more. There's a survey done by Stanford really early on. This was December, and ChatGPT launched November 2022. Just asking students how they were using it. And if you look at the very bottom, only 5% of students were using it for just direct plagiarism. The main use was brainstorming, outlining, and forming ideas. So creative thinking and helping with their writing. And ChatGPT can do more than generate information. I think a lot of people think about ChatGPT as something that you go to kind of like Google or Wikipedia, and it gives you information. It's a chatbot. So I asked ChatGPT to have a conversation with me in Spanish so I can improve my Spanish language skills, and it was happy to do so. It started off with some questions. I responded in Spanish, came back with more information, and then another question, then I responded and asked it questions. So it can be a back and forth type interaction. And one of the most creative uses I've seen from educators, this is from Tate and colleagues who wrote about ChatGPT and education, was using it as a teachable agent. So I tried it out with an area that I've been researching quite often, is professional learning networks for educators. And I tried to teach ChatGPT about that. And I start off with like one sentence, then it tells me more about that topic, then asks a question. You can see Then I try to respond with a question that provides more information. As you all know, trying to teach something to others requires deeper thinking and mental connections for learning than just trying to soak information in. And so asking students to try to use it as a teachable agent is a creative use I have seen. But of course, ChatGPT can be harmful for student learning. So research on math and science in particular is that the results are pretty abysmal. And as Mohit mentioned earlier, that it is a predictive tool. So it is guessing which words best go together. And in math and science cases where it's providing explanations or trying to solve math problems, it's not a calculator. It's not calculating those math problems. It's figuring out which words go together to create the most plausible sounding response. So in particular, math and science, but it also has been found to make up citations, fabricate information. And the challenge with ChatGPT, as opposed to other AI tools that we're familiar with, like Siri or Alexa, where you ask them a question and they say, you know, I don't understand or cannot compute. ChatGPT doesn't do that. It just will make up a response and not let you know it doesn't know the answer. And then, of course, with any kind of AI tool, it's trained on a data set. And in particular, GPT, generative pre-trained transformers, were trained on data pulled from the internet. So you can imagine all the things out there written online by humans, lots of biases, inaccuracies built in. And OpenAI, which created ChatGPT, has attempted to mitigate some of those issues, but it launched the program worldwide for public use in many countries. And not surprisingly, users found a way around a lot of the safeguards they had in place. So like you could ask ChatGPT to write a joke about women and it wouldn't do it. But then you could ask it to write a Python code which includes a joke about women, then it would do that. Users are unfortunately very creative and find ways around safeguards. What happens if students are using this and it has biased or harmful or misinformation, what that might mean for their thinking and learning. And then of course, ChatGPT was pulled from English written texts on the internet. So while it is multilingual, it can translate text into a lot of different languages. It was pulled from English language text. What does that mean? If you're asking students to use ChatGPT to revise their own writing, is that going to leave out some of their unique cultural perspectives and the ways they creatively express themselves through writing, because it's pulling from, you know, predominantly Westernized English version of what it thinks is correct writing? So something to think about. And then GPT-4 just launched, as Mohit mentioned, and I don't have full access to it, but OpenAI claims it has addressed some of these issues, like it's less likely to fabricate citations and references. It's less likely to come up with misinformation and harmful information. And it continues to use, training and with human feedback to improve. So these tools are going to continue to be programmed to be more intelligent. These issues I've brought up are with the GPT-3 model, which is the current version of ChatGPT, unless you have the Pro version. I've written an article about this that covers a lot. It focuses on teacher education, but it dives really deep into a lot of issues with AI in education in particular. And so I have this linked in the slides, and I'll put it in the chat in a moment as well. But if this is something you want to dive more deeply into and kind of get a summary of what I've talked about today, I just wanted to highlight this article that I recently just published. So I think that is it from me, and I will put these slides and the links into the chat.
Thank you. Let me give me a second to share. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Thank you again, Mohit and Tori, for the presentations. So I'm really glad to have the chance to be here and to reflect a little bit more broadly about large language models, how they're made and evaluated, and what we might or might not want for them. And this is maybe going to scope a little more broadly, especially because Tori has covered so much about education specifically already. So I'll start by saying that my outlook on these models is nicely summarized by this lovely slide that was created by Sasha Lucioni over at Hugging Face, who also crowdsourced some of the text on it from Twitter. So as the image suggests, the promised benefits of these generative AI models, including ChatGPT, are tremendous. So chat about anything, do your homework, maybe even artificial general intelligence, whatever that means. I think we can ask a lot of questions about what that means. But of course, our lovely generative AI iceberg also carries with it a number of downsides, right? So the ability to generate ever more misinformation and harmful content, exploitation of workers and of people whose language went into the model, environmental concerns, and so on. And so in this short talk, I really want to take a minute to reflect on a few things. First, I want to ask what we want out of our models. So what makes a model behavior good? And I'll argue that for generative models, we've not yet really reached a place where we, and I mean we collectively, everyone, not just NLP researchers and practitioners, we're not really at a place where we've begun to talk about or articulate what we think these models ought to be doing. So what might we want these models to do? So I think some properties might come easily, and they reflect longstanding goals of the research community, right? So I think we want these models to generate fluent or coherent text. We want them not to generate text that is toxic or offensive, right? So far, so good. But I think there's, as we engage more and more of these models, a lot of other questions about what models ought or ought not to do have come to the fore, right? And these are really complicated. For example, should language models be in the business of generating text that sounds really assertive or confident, right? Especially since, as Tori pointed out, they're going to generate text whether they know what they're talking about or not. Does this depend on whether they're providing a fact or whether they're doing some interpretation? Like if you ask something like, what are the 5 most important events of the Civil War, right? That's like necessarily requires some interpretation and synthesis. How do we think about how language models should be producing text in those circumstances? Should a model be explicitly expressing uncertainty? Should they even be explicitly pluralistic? Should they acknowledge that there might be many questions where there isn't a good single correct answer, that there might be many worldviews, right? Should they challenge the assumptions of input text, right? When maybe you ask a question based on shoddy premises. Should language models produce text claiming human-like attributes? So we might be concerned about language models that claim to have feelings, right? When you ask if it's ever gone surfing, right? It might say, yes, I went surfing with my uncle when I was 7. Of course, it hasn't done that. So we might say, okay, we don't really want models to do this. But of course, as we try to reduce the risks of anthropomorphizing these models, right, this raises all these new questions. What does non-anthropomorphic behavior even look like? These models' training behavior, right, all their training data is all language created by humans. This is what they're learning from, is like language created by humans, or interactions created by humans. What does not human language even look like, right? Like how do we even direct our systems to act, if this is what we want, right, in a not human-like way? What does it even mean? I don't know that we know what this looks like. Here's a more specific question. And this actually touches on what Tori was getting at, also thinking about kind of like different kind of cultures and like language varieties, right, with different ways of doing language. Should language models model or produce language resembling marginalized language varieties? On the one hand, I think we have an opportunity to reflect on whose language gets to be default, right? So likely we don't want white standard American English to become the default variety for what is correct or appropriate for English or for the world generally, right? On the other hand, getting the data for modeling language is typically a profoundly extractive business, usually with no recompense for the people whose language it is. So that's not great either. So how are you going to go about getting this data? In any case, the history of when you have people producing these language varieties when they're not native speakers, right? That's also generally a history of linguistic appropriation and commodification, right? It's not a very nice business, it's deeply oppressive. Do we expect machine production of these things to be any different, right? What do we want here? And so I think these raise a lot of questions about both kind of what it is that we want our models to be doing. And of course, who should be making the decisions about what our models ought to be doing. So this is far from exhaustive, but maybe I've convinced you at least that there are a lot of really challenging fundamental questions about what we want models to do that we haven't, I think, been able to collectively reflect on yet, right? Our models have just been tossed into the world, and then, and I don't think we've had the space to collectively reflect on what it is that we want from them. So this next bit I'll ask, given that we don't really know how to specify what we want from models, what is it that we're currently doing when we evaluate them? And I'm gonna hear, apologies, Mohit, I'm gonna have to be super brief and elide a ton of really interesting work in NLP, but here goes. So this is a table of results from the GPT-4 technical report, which was just released in the last few weeks. And in this table, the evaluation is in terms of well-known NLP benchmarks, right? So you can see the names in the left column. So a better model is one that performs better, right, on these NLP benchmarks. Models can also be evaluated for much more than their performance on specific benchmarks, right? So here I've pulled out a table from a recent paper called Holistic Evaluation of Language Models. And this is a paper that tries to provide a suite of metrics for assessing language models. And what they're doing in this table, it's a bit complicated, but what they're doing in this table is they've got a set of desiderata, so properties that we might want models to have or not have, that they're considering developing metrics for, right? So these are things like environmental impact, explainability, reliability, accessibility, bias, fairness, all these sorts of things that we would want perhaps to develop metrics for. And so for each of these properties that they've put in the right column, they've listed what they think is needed to measure on the left. So for example, a property like interpretability, they think requires more than black box access. They require more than black box access to a system, right? So roughly what this table just says is, here's a bunch of things you might want to know about your language models, and here's what we think is required to evaluate for those things. And what they land on in this final row, right, that I've like put a little highlighted, this final set of properties that they measure: accuracy, bias, fairness, efficiency, robustness, toxicity, uncertainty. They land on this final set of things because they believe that these properties don't induce additional requirements. So setting aside the idea that bias and fairness and toxicity, et cetera, are really properties of that are independent of broader system or social context, I defy you to come up with definitions of these things that don't require system or social context or whatever. This exercise tells us a lot about how folks are thinking about what constitutes good evaluation, right? If you're thinking about it in this way, right, good evaluation of a language model is evaluation that's independent of broader system and social context. It's abstracted away from context of use. We're trying to measure like with a minimal set of things, and that minimal set of things involves not knowing kind of what the larger systems or social context or context of system use are that we're going to be using our language models for. Right? This is one way that folks in NLP are thinking about evaluation. Okay, so do we think this is meaningful or useful model evaluation, right? Is this how we want to go about assessing our language models and deciding whether we want to use them? I'd argue not, for a couple of reasons, right? One, this is an older argument, right? We know that from existing work that benchmarks are pretty fallible. So I think when you have benchmarks that are fallible, right, just because you have a lot of them doesn't mean that you put them together doesn't mean that you have better evaluation. But the other is that just so many things we care about what these language models are not, what they're doing, are really not well captured by benchmarks. And they depend so much on the specific context in which you're using the system, right? So to me, this seems like a profoundly limited way of assessing language models, because some of these things, like the ability, whether a model helps you solve a task, whether it can communicate uncertainty, whether it can accept or acknowledge correction, whether it enables exploration or development of taste or joy or any of these things, right? All of these things depend profoundly on actual kind of context of use, right? And they can't be kind of abstracted away in these metrics or benchmarks. So I think in NLP, we currently don't evaluate for these things. I don't think we really know how. And so I want to suggest that our vocabulary for thinking through whether a model is good or not is profoundly limited right now. So to reiterate, for a given model, if you know something about its performance on benchmarks, that's actually really all you know about it. That's all you know about it. That's all you know. If you're a student, you're a teacher, you're a writer, you're a designer, right? If these things do not tell you whether it's a model that will help you, for what purpose it might be effective or helpful, when you ought to be using it, or the risks that you might be incurring in using it, right? And these are all things that people are doing deep dives in their particular use cases, like Tori, right, are uncovering, okay, for education, when I use it for this purpose, this is what happens. And so I think our vocabulary, again, is super limited for describing many or most of the things that meaningfully affect your experience with the model. So where do we go? And I'll try to be brief. First, I think we should collectively reflect on what we want to use these models for, right? Like what problems or needs actually need addressing, right? Like what do we want to use these models for? given what we want to use these models for, some kind of concrete context of use, what do we actually want models to do? And I think this is a point of like collective reflection, right? Like what is good, what is desirable? Like what is like good text, good language? What do we want to see from our models, right? What do we think is harmful? And I think these are massively complicated and depend so strongly on the context in which we want to use these things. Let's unpack and push back on assumptions that go into building and deploying and describing these things. Why is the future a single large model? Why is it general purpose? Is there such thing as general purpose, or have we stuck in a bunch of assumptions about language and speakers and use cases? Let's engage critically with these models, and I'd love to, in the discussion, talk more about what this kind of critical engagement looks like. But as text gets more and more coherent, right, reading between the lines gets harder and harder, and it will demand more and more of us to figure out when these models are right, when they're right but misleading, when they're plausible but wrong, right? These are hard. Think about conditions of model development and deployment. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion. And so there's much more we could say about this iceberg, but perhaps I'll close with a saying from a colleague of mine that I'm really taking with me these days, which is practice healthy skepticism, right? So I think in language models, in many ways, we have a solution in search of a problem. And so it really kind of behooves us to think about what those problems are, whether, these technologies are going to be really, whether the benefits are realized, or whether, in using them, we are normalizing particular types of risks or infrastructures or ecosystems that we might really not want to. So I'll stop there and excited to chat.
Right. Thanks so much for the panelists. We'll move to questions. As I mentioned, please post your question to chat, and then we'll call you to unmute yourself unless you prefer me to speak out your question. You can just specify that. The first question I think is for maybe if people generally want to respond to this. Erica Light asked if examples about how faculty across disciplines are using ChatGPT currently. Erica, did you want to elaborate on that or just leave it there?
I think that's a good paraphrase of my question. Thank you.
Okay. Does any panelists want to comment on that? Or I can just invite audience to post on chat about that.
I'll just quickly comment that I'm teaching a class on natural language processing, and strongly encouraged all the students to use ChatGPT for every assignment and exam, and ask them to write like a bit about their experience using the AI while solving all of these assignments. So I think that's been helpful. We've been looking at their feedback, and most of them are using it to kind of rewrite the answers that they've already written for example, for non-native speakers of English, this is very helpful to, fix grammatical errors and things like that. It's fewer than expected that are actually using it to, complete the homework without any student input.
Thanks. John Kingston, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. This addresses Dr. Blodgett's presentation, and that is, to what extent we've seen in other cases AI has created problems, partly because it's been produced principally with computer science. Because it hasn't been adequate collaboration between computer scientists and people in other disciplines who might be able to assess the possible harms that AI may do. And I wondered whether we know anything yet about the extent to which people who are developing ChatGPT are actually collaborating with people in other disciplines in order to avoid the kinds of problems that Dr. Blodgett referred to in her discussion.
Yeah, so I guess maybe I'll take this one. It's a great question. So I think I have a couple of thoughts. One is that for these specific technologies, I think it can be super difficult to know who contributed, in part because the process of developing these things is deeply opaque. Speaking as somebody working at Microsoft. So, you know, and for technical reports, for example, coming out, for example, describing GPT-4, you know, the author is OpenAI, right? So you really don't know kind of like who specifically for this particular technology would have kind of contributed to it, right? So I think for people trying to make sense of kind of these models and how they come to be, I think it's a very difficult, that opacity makes it very difficult to answer. Definitely the fields that are from the outside asking about these models and asking hard questions about them are deeply interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. But I do think that, and it's entirely possible that there are people from multiple disciplines kind of within OpenAI or within Google or whatever kind of working on these developing these models. But I will say that I think there's only so much influence non-computer scientists can have when like the default framing for what the problem is and like what the goal is a very computer science oriented one, right? Like the goal is to have a model. The goal is not only to have a model, but one that is maximally large, maximally powerful, maximally abstracted away from use cases, maximally general, all these things that, you know, these and the values and kind of like the framing of what the goal is in developing this is like very kind of oriented in a particular way, influenced by particular disciplinary whatever is, right? So even I think it's very difficult even for people from other disciplines to intervene kind of meaningfully when this is kind of the framing, right? This is that you've got at the outset. So I think that will be a challenge going forward for sure.
May I ask a follow-up? I think for Tori, Tori, you gave many examples of educators, I think, finding real utility from ChatGPT, at least in many cases. As far as I know, educators weren't involved with OpenAI's development of the technology. Could it be better for the education use cases, or does it matter in the terms of collaboration, or is ChatGPT just like this early research and this is a form of collaboration, asymmetrical collaboration already?
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in at the end of this and say, like nearly all other technologies, education is left out of the picture in the design and development process. It's a lot of people who make assumptions about what are the needs for society or education, and then it's thrown upon teachers and administrators and students to figure it all out. And in this case, it was launched without thinking through educational implications. So, you know, it left to entire school districts like New York City banning the tool. It left a lot of teachers scrambling right at the start of spring semester, trying to figure out plagiarism and ethics and writing and having these conversations because nothing was had ahead of time. Since then, about maybe a month ago, OpenAI released documentation called Educators' Considerations for OpenAI, and it basically says, here's all the things wrong with it for education and ways not to use it, but it's not very helpful in like how to use it, and it clearly wasn't written by an educator. So I think there's a huge missed opportunity with nearly every technology that educators and students aren't part of the conversations, and then that leads to a lot of people trying to play catch up or having these knee-jerk reactions like ban this technology or let's go back to blue books or oral exams and these kind of things that can be you know, more problematic for students, especially disabled students and traditionally marginalized students.
Thanks a lot. Ivan Arroyo, do you want to ask your question?
Kind of hi. It's kind of a follow-up to that, right? So I was saying that I can't avoid seeing the parallelism with the phenomenon of calculators in the math classroom during the 70s and 80s. And there was an initial resistance, it was prohibited, and then teachers managed to embrace it. And even the curriculum itself changed because initially they were teaching arithmetic to do long division and long algorithms with big numbers, right? And now that was kind of removed from the curriculum. And I was wondering, how do you think that teaching essay writing, for instance, would look like from now on in the classroom, given ChatGPT, and how is it that we're going to adapt?
Hi, Yvonne, good to see you. And it's a great question, and something I have seen as well as this parallelism with calculators, with Wikipedia, with the internet. Every time a big technology comes out, it's like, do we need math classes anymore? Because we have calculators. Do we need formal schooling now that we have the internet and Wikipedia? And yet here we are, schooling still persists, and we find ways to improve or adapt with these technologies. And I think ChatGPT is really interesting in terms of it's not quite a calculator. So, you know, what I found with like research or with educators talking about the calculator is it basically freed up time for more creative and critical thinking, like solving bigger problems using it as a tool. And I definitely see that in the future is there's going to be this human AI interaction turning to tools for helping with writing. But I also don't want people to forget that whereas a calculator can kind of help offload some of that memorization, writing is essential for a lot of different reasons. And if we just tell students to rely on ChatGPT to do the writing and then focus on bigger problems, that can be problematic because writing is helpful for deepening thinking, improving memory, helping with synthesis of ideas. It's 21st century employability skill. So I think that educators will find ways to adapt with this tool, but I'm hoping it doesn't mean writing instruction goes away altogether or shifts to more, you know, higher order thinking activities, application of knowledge. All of these things are important, but that process of writing is so important. And what I'm hoping with ChatGPT is it'll nudge or force educators to think more closely about being transparent about why students are being asked to write, because we don't talk about that when we're teaching, of like, write this essay or critique this, and they just do it. If we can be more transparent about why they're doing it, not just doing it so I can grade them, but doing it to help their thinking, or you know, then they might think differently about what role ChatGPT might play in that process versus I'll just have ChatGPT do it because I don't want to do this critique. So that's sort of what I'm seeing, but a great question in thinking about this tool.
Thank you, Tori. That was a wonderful answer. Thanks.
If we scroll ahead a little bit, if Shivan May, if you're there, had a follow-up question to John's. Shivan, are you there?
Oh, yes. Hi. Yeah, I was just appreciated John Kingston's question because as a humanities person trained in the humanities and now work in computer science, I find it, interesting to think through what and how like cultures around computing, what sort of epistemologies are at play when you have something like an anonymous, sort of what Dr. Blodgett was talking about, right? That there's a certain degree of opacity, yet we know that there's a lot of capital behind that opacity too. And so I just wonder, in terms of like, as a researcher and as a teacher, what are the sort of cultures of collaboration that are possible in a research and university setting? But, you know, I also see the sort of proximity of CS with industry. It feels like there's a lot to sort of unpack. And so it was more just me appreciating John Kingston's question. I'm doing that academic thing where like, I don't really have a question. I liked the assertion.
I find it a really like useful reflection, and I'm interested in your thoughts on whether there are limits to kind of like collaboration, right, or even kind of like teaching kind of like ethics or these kinds of like solutions, because I think there's a lot of work, right, we can do maybe in academia or whatever to dismantle a particular, like to hold up for reflection, to dismantle particular like epistemologies that CS students are entering and leaving with, for example, and that kind of thing. But I also think at the end of the day, there's only like, it's a question of like infrastructure in these ecosystems, and a question of like, there are larger structural questions, and there's only so much you can do when there's a few small companies making these things, and that there is no legislation to, right? Your mechanisms are legislation or regulation, or you look really bad and you start losing money. And those are not really terrific, like mechanisms for kind of like getting the outcomes that we might care about. And so, I mean, I do think it is, I don't know how possible they are, but I would like to imagine a future where we can think about, you know, is there a way in which we could have a smaller model, have them be more like kind of distributed, even have them cooperatively or publicly owned, right? I mean, like, what are all the different kind of like structures like, you know, we could set up? Because I think there's a lot that we can say and a lot we can do. We could try to write, we can try to teach, but I think structurally, you know, with the structures as they are, there's maybe very little that can meaningfully change.
All right, Coach Cheng, I believe has, feel free to ask your question, specify what type of research maybe.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm wondering what kind of research we can do in academia now, given that most of the problem can be solved by scaling up the model size, the data set, but we cannot do that in the academia. It's kind of sad that if this is the ultimate solution to all of these AI problems. Yeah, that's my question.
I have a reaction, but I just answered the last one, so I don't know if someone wants to jump in first.
Sure, I guess I can comment briefly, only from the computer science perspective. I think that there's actually lots of exciting problems now that can be done in academia. Like there's no reason these models need to be so big and closed off to inspection from the public or researchers like ourselves. And this is already changing. So for example, Stanford just, as I mentioned before, essentially extracted one of OpenAI's models and released it publicly. And now researchers from all over can download this model and use it and modify it and make it run on their own tasks. And this was just the first attempt. I'm sure there will be many more like this in the near future. And yeah, as to what Su Lin was saying, I would certainly expect the current situation of 2 or 3 companies hoarding these models to not persist for much longer, which will again open up the research problems that we as academics can work on regarding these models. Like obviously they have to be made smaller. There are different sorts of language model configurations that might be better than this one, but because again only 2 companies have tried scaling them up like this, we don't know what kind of design decisions could actually be better than the ones that they're using. So yeah, I'm very optimistic. And I think we've seen the same kind of thing over and over again in computer science. Like there's some big model that one company releases, and then 2 years later it's obsolete and everyone can use it and it's replaced with something else. So yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
Maybe I'll add quickly also that, like, from my perspective, and I know I'm biased here, but like making things do better on benchmarks by making them larger. I mean, like the fact that you can do that is sort of a foregone conclusion, right? It's like the least interesting thing you could possibly do, I think. And I think we're still speculating, like really speculating about how these things could actually be meaningfully used in the world, right? Like, do they actually help you solve a problem? What do users think about them? Do users like interact with them, right? Like I think everything interesting comes down to actually like taking them and thinking about like what applications could meaningfully like arise from them and what we might want out of that. And that will require a lot of deep and careful work to think about those like different settings and contexts. And I think for me at least, I think that is like much more interesting than trying to scale things up.
I see. Thanks.
All right, one note, Tori just had to leave for another meeting, so thanks, Tori, for your time. We are at 1 o'clock. Feel free to go if you have to go. If you don't mind, I propose maybe 5 more minutes. We have so many exciting questions that we can get going. Some people think it's okay. Okay. I'll note also the post from Anna on Center for Teaching and Learning is having a session on teaching writing specifically, if you want to get more fine-grained on that. Sorry, I forgot to put that on these slides. Put it here, the URLs in the chat if you want to look. If you're interested, please take a look and consider participating in that. I think the next question is from Elisa Martinez. Do you want to ask your question?
I should say this is not the Elisa Martinez who posed that question. I sent out my link, but whoever posted that question, please claim it.
Is this Jackie?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Lisa Martinez. Okay, that's weird. Sorry. So speaking of clinically useful applications, maybe potentially, or maybe this is like way too ambitious. First, thanks for this great talk. I'm really interested in clinical rehabilitative uses for people who've had left hemisphere strokes and aphasia. The major hallmark of which is, coming up with the next word that you want to say. And so I'm just wondering, like, how long might it take? How large of a data set would you need to train from an individual? Because every person with aphasia is different. It really depends on, where the focus and how large the extent of the lesion is. Like how many prefixes, how much text would you need to train a language learning model to be able to predict the next word that they want to say? If you had a data set of like story retelling, for instance, where you know what the topic is, and people with aphasia know what they want to say, they just have difficulty saying it. So, given all the issues that have come up in training models with competent language, is it like way crazy ambitious to be thinking about training models that are not as competent in their language use?
So I think my first answer to that would be, I would strongly recommend not training a separate model, because these large models already have learned a lot of the like linguistic knowledge that you might want in the model that you described, right, of predicting the next word. What I would recommend is if you wanted to personalize like an existing model for a particular individual with this kind of issue, then there's a class of techniques now called prompt engineering, where you might put examples of that particular individual's speaking patterns while they're retelling the story into the prefix of the language model, and have it kind of try and generalize what they're trying to say from there. Yeah, I'm not sure if that would work. I'm not really too familiar with how much variation there is between different individuals with aphasia. So that is what I would recommend as the easiest thing. And then maybe after that, because there's also lots of privacy issues with training your own model using an external service on someone's private data. So yeah, I guess that exists with the method I described as well.
I think your answer is better than ChatGPT's. That was posted in the chat also.
Oh.
Oh no.
Okay, I promise that we will end now, but we have one last question. Let's say this is the very last question, if you don't mind. Sancha Midwinter, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. This has been just really illuminating, and I'm already thinking of so many different ways that it can be used. I'm currently preparing for a workshop on decolonial pedagogies. And one of the points that I would like to share with the audience is this idea of presenting to students that the theories or research, whatever it is that we're sharing with them, they don't always have foundations within Western academia. And because we're all trained, right, with certain theorists or certain research, et cetera, we tend to replicate that in our teaching. And one of the things that I really want to be able to do is to be able to come up to have a concept or whatever it is, and to be able to trace it back or to find it in different locations, such as the Global South, et cetera, even if it exists in a different language at a particular time, so that as professors, we can stand before the class, present what we're presenting and say, but these ideas were not just generated by this professor, whoever at UMass, but we can find other academics, et cetera, who've come up with similar ideas. Is that something, do you think, that this tool can help us with, given that it does pull in from different geographical locations?
Maybe I'll take a stab, but I'm also curious what Mo has to say about this. I think it's worth taking a shot, but carefully, because these models are trained mostly on like the Western canon, right? And also on text on the internet, right? So what it's least likely to have in its training data, like the language that is least likely to have seen, is precisely the kinds that we're trying to uncover, right? The kinds that we're trying to bring to the light and say, hey, like this is stuff we're not paying attention to. And so there's a very good chance that that is precisely what these models are gonna miss, right? If you ask it, like, what scholars today pay attention to. But it's possible that the training data is large enough that it might, know about or have references to these things. So it's worth, I think, taking a shot and looking with the knowledge that it won't be complete, and it won't be complete for the exact reason that like structurally we're trying to bring these things into the light. But I think there could be useful exercises in like also not just asking it to mention these people or this work, but also to ask it to describe this work, and then you cast an eye on how it describes and says, are these descriptions of this work also carrying in all these like assumptions that we want to take down, right? Like maybe it doesn't, maybe if it knows about it, maybe it misunderstands it. Maybe it like isn't really able to characterize these things, right? And maybe it's actually useful to like look at it and pick it apart and say, what does like the way that ChatGPT is describing this work, if it's wrong, is it wrong in important ways that reflect like how we kind of like in the Western kind of canon or whatever, like think about this work, right? Maybe that itself is like really kind of an important kind of opportunity for kind of reflection. So I'd be really interested to know kind of what the outcome of this might be.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly follow up. I really liked Sulin's answer. One thing that I think we will see more of in the next year or two is models like ChatGPT that are also augmented with some sort of retrieval functionality from an external data set. So if you had, for example, you knew like this large collection of works is where you want to, make these connections to, you could ask ChatGPT, for example, like go search through this collection of books and find similar ideas or things like that. And, that's kind of possible right now, but not with the publicly available interfaces, but I expect it to be possible in the future. Another quick thing I'll add on top of what Sulin mentioned is, of course, these models have been trained mostly on, the Western canon and English language text and, but that said, they do exhibit like remarkable translation abilities that are much better even for lower resource languages than the existing like best machine translation systems such as Google Translate or DeepL. So I think these companies are continuing to acquire human feedback in these different languages. So even if their training data is mostly English oriented, they continue to increase the amount of feedback that they receive in many different languages. And so, there are issues, of course, with how much they might be paying these people who are improving the capabilities of their system in other languages and so on. But in terms of like the quality of the output, we might be able to see systems that are able to understand like complex ideas in many different languages and GPT-4, for example, already is quite impressive.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think we have to wind down now. Just to note, thanks so much everyone for coming. And of course, thanks to the panelists also. We've had, just among the questioners, we had participation from at least 6 different departments at UMass. I saw we've had participants just among ones I know from other institutions as well. So it's great to have a chance to bring people together and get these different perspectives from both the technical and social sides of the coin. Join me and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Go to the CSSI website, sign up for a mailing list, hear about other events to bring together people from across campus, across disciplines. Otherwise, take care and see you all around.